The War is Over. The Stonehouse Series by Mike and Dianne Heintzemans, Chapter 8. Miles away, a mob had gathered. For some, the time had come to face a reckoning with the law. 3 guilty persons, 1 woman and 2 men, stood huddled with sad faces, each one admitting to their sins. Around them, near a shoreline, stood a dozen who were chosen, and collectively they will administer, watch, and bear record. It is time, declared one of the 2 which will carry out the chore. Each takes firm grip of the woman near her shoulders, and then they pull her backwards, further out into the shore. Waiting and silent, they stand in hip-deep water. On the river's edge are more watchers and witnesses, and some shed silent tears for the woman. Some wipe around their eyes with empty hands, and yet each watcher understands the need of what is being done. Both men together, with a nod between each other, push the woman backward and under the water. One, born from compassion, looks into her open eyes and speaks with words which she cannot hear. At first there's a struggle, but then all struggle stops, and finally, confident their deed is done, they pull her body up from the water and bring it back to shore. Next, a man with tears flowing steps into his place, knowing that he was next in line, and he goes without a struggle. With this one, their timing was slightly different, and he heard some of their spoken words before they forced him down into the death. And I baptized you. It is all he heard before he was immersed into a relationship picture of death, burial, and the resurrection. Raising him up a moment later, Peter and John took his hand and led him back to shore. John informed him as they walked, "Push beneath the water portrays that your old man is dying and guilty under the law. Held below the water was that of being buried, and then rising is the life of God coming alive, brand new inside of you, a thing that Jesus declares is soon to happen." Yes. Yes. "Thank you," the joyful man responded, hugging John, causing the mostly dry upper portion of John's half-drenched body to become more wet. "You are welcome." "Next," John said, moving back out to the deeper water with one more disciple of Jesus to baptize. 2 miles south, the murky water in which they stood flowed through the river Jordan's mouth, forever to be entombed within the Dead Sea's stone enclosure. Northeast, near Beersheba, a flock of black-feathered ravens speckle the horizon. Gazing 5 miles northwest and slightly uphill were green fields, the spring-fed cropland of Jericho. Closer by, 100 feet away, and on the eastern gravel banks of the Jordan River, was Jesus, telling stories, parables, to a captive crowd of a few hundred people. Most were struggling to understand the mystery of his words. The day was peaceful, an early afternoon, bright blue sky with a slight southern breeze. All this was clothed in a balmy 75 degrees. And Jesus continued with another story. A farmer went out to plant his fields, casting seed into the ground. And it came to pass, as he sowed the seed, some fell by the wayside, where birds came and devoured it up. Peter and John had the next man ready to baptize, and they held their charge by his shoulders and pushed him under the water. With both his hands under water, John looked up and over at Jesus, trying to hear his story. And some fell on the stony ground, where it had not much earth, and immediately sprouted up, because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun came up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. Peter, gazing down into the man's eyes and holding him under water, asked, "What story is he telling now? Can you hear?" And some fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no fruit. John answered as they pulled the man back upward, "The one about the farmer planting wheat seed in a field. And other seed fell on good ground, and did yield fruit, that sprang up and increased, and some brought forth 30 times what was planted, and some 60 times, and some 100 times what was planted." Peter continued in his conversation with John as they brought the man back to shore. "I don't get it. What does he mean? What does planting seed in a field have to do with anything other than eventually eating a loaf of bread?" Jesus was silent for a moment, watching a running figure across the river about a quarter mile away. Wondering about the meaning of his story, people in the crowd tipped their heads and scratched their chins, some murmuring to the other person standing nearest to them. "You seem to understand his stories if he tells one about catching fish, though," Peter whispered back. "Well, his fishing stories usually make more sense." In conclusion to his story, Jesus shouted, "He that has ears to hear, let him hear." Peter and John stood on the shoreline, both dripping water, and with no more people to baptize at the moment, John asked, "Why don't you just ask him what he means?" "John, it will look like I don't know." "Huh? Isn't that the point?" Jesus, keeping one eye on the approaching runner, who was less than 2 miles out now, traded another story for a question, asking, "What should we say is like the kingdom of God? Or with what comparison should we compare it? It is like a grain of mustard seed, which, when it is sown in the earth, is the smallest of all seeds that are planted." The runner's identity could now be told. It was Benjamin of Bethany, from the house of Hess. "But when it is planted, it grows up, and it becomes greater than all herbs, and sends out large branches, so that the birds of the air may lodge under the shadow of it."